Kevin is a fellow at the Centennial Institute. He hosts the Crossover Network, a CCU networking and seminar forum for leaders in the business and nonprofit communities. Kevin's a businessman. He's the co-founder of a web-based services firm and the founder and president of Whitestone Miller, a venture consulting firm. Kevin is an educator. He was the founding dean of CCU School of Business, and now he is an executive in residence at CCU to the great benefit of our wonderful students and to the entire CCU community. Kevin's an author. The second prop that I did not bring up is Kevin's book, his most recent work titled Freedom Nationally, Virtue Locally, or Socialism. If you are a social conservative, and frankly, even if you're not, this book will challenge you. And here's where I make the plug and hold the book up and say it's available out in the lobby. I don't have it with me, but you get the idea. Kevin did not ask me to plug his book, but it's a wonderful, quick read, so I'd encourage you to take a look at it. Kevin has challenged my thinking over the past year that I've known him, and he is a great American and a great man. Jonathan Feiner is one of our shining stars at CCU, a wonderful, wonderful young man, a CCU student. He's an intern this summer at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., in the Office of the President. He will be one of 2 pages from Colorado, serving at the Republican National Convention in Florida later this summer. You know, I don't have the opportunity to meet a lot of our students in my role at CCU. I'm out a lot, off campus a lot. But I have had the opportunity to visit with Jonathan a number of times over the last few months, and he is an amazing young man. He has a heart for the Lord. He has a heart for public policy, for politics. And I would say, you want to keep your eye on Jonathan Feiner. I suspect you'll hear more about him in the years to come. Jonathan and Kevin will be introducing James Robison and Jay Richards. Would you please help me welcome Jonathan Feiner and Kevin Miller?
Good morning. Isn't this a fantastic event? It's just such a pleasure to see all of you. Isn't it great? Yeah. It's my pleasure to introduce you James Robison. He's working with Jay Richards. They're going to be a combined presentation, so Jay will be speaking first. James Robison is a good friend of mine, and I want to tell you why you should listen to James Robison today. Don't listen to James because he's spoken in over 600 venues around the country, full to the brim, breaking attendance records that the Rolling Stones didn't, and appear with Billy Graham throughout the 70s and 80s, although he did that. Don't listen to James because he has an international missions outreach that has literally saved the lives of thousands of young children, saved countless young women from child prostitution, and dug water wells, although he's done that too. Don't listen to James because millions, 20 million plus, have come to an understanding of Jesus Christ through James' primary vocation, that of an evangelist. But here's why you should listen to James. James has stood up twice at critical times in our country as a citizen patriot. And the first one's quite interesting. You see, he's a Southern Baptist evangelist. And in the late 70s, he saw a Southern Baptist president, and he realized that perhaps not all people of faith had the same views politically as he saw President Carter. And he convened a large group using his influence as a well-known and highly effective evangelist. And he convened a huge number of pastors, cutting across all lines. And Ronald Reagan spoke to that group. And James told Ronald Reagan, he coached him on what to say. And what Reagan said that day was groundbreaking. He said, "I know you can't endorse me, but I want you to know I endorse you." And that was a watershed moment as people of faith realized they could come together and impact their country as patriots themselves with their faith postures at work in the political marketplace. Well, James and his wife Betty, who's here as well today, have become alarmed, as many of us have, in a special way in the last few years. And James is stepping up once more as a citizen patriot, raising the alarm that there's something amiss in the country. And he's written a book with Jay Richards, Indivisible, which you'll hear about shortly. Don't listen to James for the reasons of his primary vocation, but listen to him today carefully as a deep thinker, as a Christian statesman in his discussion of liberty today. And now for Jonathan to speak of Jay Richards.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and as President Armstrong would say, my fellow sinners. It is an honor and privilege to be before you today to introduce our next speaker. Jay Richards is a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, where he directs the Center on Wealth, Poverty, and Morality. Dr. Richards has written many academic articles, books, and essays on a wide variety of subjects and produced several documentaries. A previous book he wrote, Money, Greed, and God, received a Templeton Enterprise Award in 2010. This book also had a significant impact on my education in economics by giving an understandable approach for the moral argument for free markets, and showed that all you really need to know about free markets and economics you learned in kindergarten. I won't reveal the secret. You can ask him about that afterwards. When Dr. Richards isn't appearing on Larry King Live, lecturing members of the U.S. Congress, or producing documentaries, he's a contributing editor of the American, which is a publication of the American Enterprise Institute. He's a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a research fellow and director of Acton Media at the Acton Institute. He's here today with co-author James Robison of their latest book, Indivisible, Restoring Faith, Family, and Freedom Before It's Too Late. Today, our society is riddled with issues ranging from fatherless homes and abortions, a national debt on the verge of $16 trillion, and a government that is growing increasingly out of control. To quote Dr. Richards, today we are fighting a culture war, not a civil war. A culture war is unlike ordinary political debates. It's a fight over the fundamental principles on which cultures are based, end quote. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jay Richards.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. I'm now at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, but have been at a number of think tanks actually throughout my career. And I'm a little intimidated. I mean, try to put yourself in my shoes, okay? So we've heard from governors, we've heard from Glenn Beck, we've heard some amazing speakers, and now you're going to hear from a philosopher that's going to use slides first thing in the morning, right? So that's sort of the basic story. But I honestly felt like something important was supposed to happen here this weekend. A couple of weeks ago, I had given a speech, and I lost my voice right after that, and didn't have a voice for several days. That kind of finally worked its way out. And then last Tuesday, just before I was to come down here, I threw out my back and could barely stand, so I had to go get some medicine. But I spent 2 days down at Summit Ministries earlier in the week in Colorado Springs where the fires were, and I thought, gosh, there's so much opposition. I feel like I have to get down to Colorado. And I got to tell you, the energy in this room is spectacular. I spend most of my time in Seattle, right in the city. And so you can imagine if you're sort of conservative Christian in Seattle, if you don't get out to things like this frequently, you start to think, well, maybe I'm the one that's crazy, you know? But this book, Indivisible, what we want to do in it is actually in the title. James Robison and I are convinced that conservatives, if we learn to work together and learn to think together and commit ourselves to a foundational set of principles, can still turn the culture around. The problem is, of course, is that there are a lot of things that want to separate us. All of us, part of the conservative movement, know, for instance, that conservatism is often described as a three-legged stool, right? And this is like a sort of common way of describing conservatism. The idea of a three-legged stool is that there are these three coalitions that come together in the American conservative movement. There's fiscal conservatives, so those are the people that are interested in limited government, free markets, government doing a few things and then otherwise staying out of our lives. Social conservatives, who are concerned about cultural issues, but also concerned these days especially about questions of life, abortion, euthanasia, questions about marriage and family, and questions about religious freedom. And those are often called social conservatives. And then the third leg you could sort of call foreign policy conservatives, but just people that believe we ought to have a muscular foreign policy and a powerful defense, and that's one of the core competences of the government. And so these three ideas, or these three sort of strands, supposedly come together to form the conservative movement. Now, the media loves this description because it makes it sound like conservatism is essentially a marriage of convenience, right? It's three different, disparate groups of people that don't actually agree amongst themselves, that have different worldviews. In fact, since there's three, it'd be like, I guess, a polygamous marriage of inconvenience, right? I mean, that's the idea that a lot of folks want to believe about the conservative movement. And there are intellectual tensions, unfortunately. And the one tension I want to talk about this morning, really two, is this tension that we've heard something about already. Is there really a fundamental contradiction between the things that most libertarians believe and the things that social conservatives believe? And is there a conflict, as many young Christians now believe? I spent a lot of time on college campuses. A lot of the 18 to 21-year-old Christians in the United States are convinced that capitalism and free enterprise is fundamentally incompatible with being a Christian. That is, they think that our economic system is fundamentally immoral and contradicts the Christian worldview. Those are, I think, the two most potent and dangerous conflicts that I think we have to deal with if we're really going to have in the conservative movement not merely a marriage of convenience or a marriage of inconvenience, but an intellectual program that we can stand firm on and that we can come together on in the public square to transform the public square. In the book Indivisible, James and I argue that in terms of the diagnosis about what's happened in our culture, something like 86% of the population self-identify as Christian, and a sizable number beyond that actually subscribe to the idea that there's a creator and that we're endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights. If that's true, that means a majority of the American public are theists, Jews, Christians, something like that. And yet, so how is it that the commanding heights of culture have been almost entirely occupied by the secular left? What exactly has happened? Remember, in the first century, a small band of persecuted Christians were hounded and tortured and killed by the Roman Empire. And yet within 3 centuries, they had transformed Western civilization and the Roman Empire itself. Now, if they can do that, why is it that some 86% of us can't manage to turn the culture around? Well, we think the reason that we can't do that is because we spend a lot of time fighting amongst ourselves. So what I want to talk about just for a couple of minutes before I hand things over to James is this tension that some people see between the social conservatives and fiscal conservatives, and this tension between capitalism and the Judeo-Christian worldview. You know, right after the 2008 election, there was a debate among conservatives about whose fault it was that we'd lost the election. And a lot of people were sniping at each other. And so you got so-called fiscal conservatives or libertarians who were attacking the social conservatives and saying, you know, if we hadn't been saddled with this debate about gay marriage or a pro-life issue, we could have won this election. And it went back and forth. But I found this quote online in one of these debates that's a kind of perfect distillation of the complaint. I'm going to call it the libertarian complaint, not because all libertarians think this way, but because at least there's a sizable group of people, I think, in the Republican Party that do see it this way. This is what this guy said. He said, social conservatives need to understand that moderates, libertarians, small government conservatives, national security conservatives generally share their values on the issues of lower taxes, reducing government spending, strong defense, gun control, but that the social conservatives' positions on abortion, gay rights, etc., are seen as government intrusion on personal liberty based on a particular religious belief system. Okay, so do you see his point? What he is saying is that if you believe in limited government and individual rights and things like that, things that conservatives are supposed to believe in, you're actually being inconsistent if you think the government ought to also take a pro-life position, or that it ought to also recognize the traditional view of marriage. You're saying that's actually intellectually inconsistent. You can believe in limited government, or you can believe in this kind of authoritarian idea where the government enforces a particular religious belief system, but you can't do both. I think that's a much more important kind of intellectual disagreement that we want to resolve, rather than the sort of things that the left might want to foist upon us. And a lot of people, I've talked to some people this weekend that have expressed something like this idea. And so let's just talk for a few minutes about what I would call the tough cases. So for the person that sees himself as a fiscal conservative or a libertarian, the tough cases are fairly obvious. They're life, marriage, and religious freedom. So let's just take life. I can't cover all of these. But let's see if we can show that even given what libertarians believe, they ought to be pro-life. In fact, I'd go farther. I would say if libertarians believe what they claim to believe about individual dignity and rights and that a state must recognize that, you can get from that to a defense of traditional marriage that's recognized by the state. Now, the argument's a little more long and complicated, so let's just take life this morning. So here's the question. If you think of yourself as a libertarian and you believe the government ought to be limited, the question is, what limits the state? What is the thing that makes the government limited? What are we talking about when we say that? Well, obviously we're talking about this idea that the government, the state, has some core competence, some things it's supposed to do and other things it's not supposed to do. It has a proper jurisdiction, and then there's areas that it really has no jurisdiction over. Well, the sort of short answer of what limits the state is what you might call philosophically pre-political realities. All right, now that's probably a construction you haven't heard before, but what I'm talking about when I say pre-political realities is that if a government is limited, it recognizes that there are things out there already in the world that a just and limited government recognizes. It doesn't define those things, it doesn't redefine them, it simply recognizes those pre-political realities that were out there already existing before a political experiment ever got off the ground. And of course, the most important pre-political reality that most libertarians emphasize is the individual, right? Now remember, every president, I've been able to find quotes, certainly from George Washington, but from FDR all the way to President Obama, and all of them say things like this. The government does not give us our rights. We get our rights from God, and a just and limited government simply recognizes those rights. That's a hugely important way of putting it. It's exactly how Thomas Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence, right? We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, those things, those individuals with natures and rights, those exist prior to the state. A state doesn't define what those are. If a state is limited, it simply recognizes that there are individuals that have a proper domain of autonomy and freedom that a just government must recognize. Now, this is exactly the opposite of the progressive sort of understanding of the individual, and certainly the communist understanding of the individual. In the 20th century, certainly Soviet communism argued that there wasn't anything like an individual with inherent rights. Rather, the individual only has existence and meaning and purpose insofar as it's a part of the sort of state collective, right? It's a fundamentally different view of what the human person is. And so if you're a libertarian that believes in limited government, you already believe there's something outside the state that it simply must recognize. There's at least one pre-political reality, right? The individual. So no one would say, well, I don't think the government should get into the individual business. You know, let's kind of stay out of our lives. I happen to think individuals have rights, but you know, some people don't think that. So, you know, live and let live. Right? We wouldn't see that as a libertarian position. We'd see that as anarchy. In fact, the whole point of the American experiment is that a limited state recognizes those things outside it. Now, it's so important because even Ayn Rand, sort of the hardcore atheist and ardent defender of capitalism in the 20th century, said this. Now, remember, Rand was an atheist, and yet she could say this: man, every man, is an end in himself and not a means to the ends of others. Now, I don't know where Rand got that in her worldview, right? But I mean, I'm a Christian and an American. I look at that and say, yes, exactly. We're made in the image of God. We are ends in ourselves. We're not simply tools for other people to use. And so Rand herself believed in the inherent dignity and value of the individual. Well, guess what? That's precisely the same foundation of the pro-life argument. Now, Rand herself was rabidly pro-choice, but she was pro-choice not by saying, well, the unborn are humans, but it's okay to murder. What she did is she believed this kind of pseudoscientific theory in which she thought that the unborn child went through different stages, and so at one stage was a fish and a reptile, and this sort of crazy stuff that no one seriously believes. But she thought, you know, if you kill an unborn a being inside the womb of his mother, you're not actually killing a human. So she had a way around this, and so, but she was inconsistent, but she still believed in the inherent dignity of the individual. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, but you know, if you're pro-life, you're basically imposing some kind of religious idea on the question. That's not true. If you read the literature, the sort of debate over the pro-life issue, you will never find anyone talking about theological questions such as, when does the soul enter the body and things like that. In fact, all you need to get from the inherent dignity and value of the individual, which a state must protect, to the pro-life case is a little clear thinking and basic biology. Every one of you was at one point in time an embryo. Every one of you at one time was a fetus. Every one of you was at one point a preborn child and a newborn and an infant and a toddler and a child and a teenager. What are those things? Are we describing different realities? Of course not. We're simply describing different stages in development of the same identical individual through time. And so if each of us are humans and we are identical with something that was once an embryo or a fetus, then whatever that is, by definition, it has to be human. And in fact, if you actually look at the biology, there's no non-arbitrary way of excluding a preborn human being from the sort of class of people that are members of the human race. You get all sorts of kind of ad hoc justifications. Well, the child, this being is dependent on another for its existence. It's small. It's not self-aware. Weird things like this, but we'd never use these criteria to divine other people out of existence, right? I mean, we don't think because people are smaller than others that they're less valuable. We don't think if a small child that's just been born is also dependent upon its mother. It doesn't mean it's not human. In other words, all you actually need is a commitment to the inherent dignity of the individual and then the basic libertarian idea that the main job of the state is to protect human beings and human individuals from molestation and destruction at the hands of others. The libertarian's not an anarchist. The libertarian believes the state has a role, and it's supposed to recognize these realities out there and protect them. So you can actually get from the libertarian sort of worldview straight to, I think, a pro-life cause fairly easily. Now, you can also do it, believe it or not, when you're talking about marriage, because there's other pre-political realities. See, I think the problem is that sometimes people think, well, the only thing the government ought to recognize are individuals, and there's just nothing else out there. But, if you look around, there's at least three other pre-political realities. There's the church, there's the family, and there's the institution of marriage. In fact, the institution of marriage is more universal, historically, than the American ideal of individual rights. In every time, place, and religion that we know of, those places have all recognized this fundamental institution, a human institution based in human nature. There's diversity, of course. Polygamy would be the most sort of radical diversity. But you can still, if you study these different cultures, whether you're in England or you're in Papua New Guinea, marriage is always understood as having something to do with a public commitment of a man and a woman who are complementary beings coming together in a public covenant for the bearing and the raising of children. That's what the word marriage in English has meant. And every other language has some word for referring to that institution. And so if that's what marriage is, then we need a word for it. And so whatever you think about homosexuality or, same-sex partnerships or whatever, there's still this reality out there in the world that's universal. And so what that means is that if a government is limited and just as it recognizes the reality of individuals, it will also recognize the pre-political reality of a universal institution such as marriage. So you see the point? A tolerant government will do that. It's not a tolerant act for a state to decide that it's going to arrogate to itself the authority to redefine an institution that exists prior to it, just as it wouldn't be tolerant for a government to redefine what the human individual is. No, that's actually a totalitarian act. If a government is just and limited, it will recognize those realities outside itself, and those include things like individual rights and individuals, churches, voluntary institutions, and above all, the institution of the family. Now, you see the point? That argument doesn't require that we get into a debate on theology. It doesn't require that we try to interpret Genesis 1. We're simply going from this belief that a limited government recognizes those things outside its jurisdiction, and then you kind of just think for a while about what those things are, and you get straight from a commitment to limited government to a government that recognizes the rights of unborn human beings and the legitimacy and reality of the institution of marriage. That doesn't convince everyone, but I think anyone that thinks of himself as a libertarian, thinks consistently and clearly, is not sort of rabidly pro-choice, ought to see the wisdom in this. And this is important because we've got to learn how to think together. James and I wanted to develop an argument in Indivisible that gives us a set of principles and arguments in which all of us who identify as conservative can actually think alike and see why we need to go together. Now, there's a lot of interesting cross-connections between social and fiscal issues. I'll give you one. The number one predictor of childhood poverty in the United States is whether there's a father in the home of that child or not. In other words, an economic issue, probably the most important one, whether a child lives in poverty in this country, is determined by a so-called social or moral issue, the health of the family. These things simply can't be separated. So let's take the other side of the argument, though, this moral dilemma that really a lot of young Christians actually see, and we saw it in the Occupy Wall Street movement, which, I don't think they accomplished a lot, but they did accomplish this new way of speaking in which people are talking in terms of the 99% and the 1%. This is a very prevalent idea, and a lot of people think, look, if we're created equal, how just is it that some people have a lot more money than others? We have this in our language, right? Some people get more than their fair share. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. A lot of people, I assure you, millions of people, especially millions of college students that are otherwise Christians and maybe theologically conservative, nevertheless think that an economic system that allows inequality is immoral. So what do we say about that? Well, what I would argue is that when people see economic inequality and immediately think it's immoral, they think they're making a moral judgment. But what they're doing is that they're connecting an observation and a legitimate moral intuition about human equality with a bad understanding of the reality of economics. And because they do that, they misunderstand what's happening in the economy as a whole. Well, Jonathan mentioned that I learned everything that I needed to know in economics in kindergarten. I do say that in this book. It was actually really more or less the 6th grade. Because what people are doing when they think that inequality is unjust is they are assuming that our economy, that a free trade economy, is a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game, it's a word from game theory. Many of you may have heard it before. All it means is that a zero-sum game is a win-lose game. And so that means the logic of the rules is such that if one person wins, somebody else has to lose. And so that's, football, baseball, basketball, chess, checkers, most of the games we play, right? It's just the logic of the game. If there's one person that's going to win, another person has to lose. So it sums to zero, win-lose. So you can just imagine there's obviously at least two other kinds of games. There's win-lose or zero-sum. There's lose-lose, right? Those are games where everyone that plays ends up worse off as a result. Right? We don't play those games a lot, or at least more than once, obviously. Once you do it, it's like, why are we doing this? That would be a lose-lose game. There are not a lot of examples. But if there's win-lose and there's lose-lose, then there's, at least in theory, there have got to be win-win games. A win-win game is not a game where everyone ends up equally well off. It's a game in which everyone that plays over time ends up better off than they would have been if they hadn't played. So the comparison is not between me and the guy across the street with a Ferrari. The comparison is between me in a free economy and me if I were in an unfree economy. And if we are better off as a result of a certain type of economic system, and all of us end up better off, then we're in a win-win game. So the question is, what is a free market economy? Well, what's funny about this is the second you sort of ask it, you can answer it. It's a fairly simple illustration. And this is what I learned in the 6th grade. In the 6th grade, we were in from recess one day, and our teacher apparently had anticipated the bad weather because she came into class with toys, probably bought in a dollar bin somewhere at a department store, and passed out these toys one by one to each of the students. And these were all things like silly putty egg, paddle ball, Barbie trading cards, stuff like this. And so she passed them out to all the members of the class, and she said, okay, now look around. And we looked around, and everybody had a different toy. And she said, okay, I want you to compare your toy to what everybody else has. Write down between 1 and 10. If you really like your toy, give it a 10. If you hate it, you trade it for anything else, give it a 1. But it's totally up to you. So we all wrote down our numbers on a piece of paper. And then she had us call out the numbers, and she added up the total, and she put them on a board, right? So let's say, I don't remember the number, let's say it was 75. I said, okay, now in the first round of the game, you can freely trade with anyone else or anyone else that's in your row. All right, so think of this as sort of 5 rows of 5 seats to keep it simple. So what that meant is each of us had 4 potential trading partners. And notice she said, you can freely trade with anyone that's in your row. What does that mean? Does that mean I'm free to clock the smaller kid over the head and sort of take his toy? No, of course not. If it's free, it means it's free on both sides. And so it means that it's only going to happen if both people want to trade. And so you can imagine there were a few trades that people were trading within the row, but not a lot of activity. And then once it settled down, she said, okay, now grade the toy you have in your hand. She had us do that. We called out the number again, and she wrote the number on the board. Now guess what happened? You've heard me tell this story, you know what happened. The number went up. Now this might seem obvious, but I would maintain this is one of the greatest mysteries in the universe right here. All right? Nothing new's been added to the system, right? Now it really got interesting in the second round. She said, now you can freely trade with everyone else in the room. So suddenly you can imagine the pandemonium that results if you know anything about networks, because everybody's got 24 potential trading partners initially, and then lots of secondary trades. And so you get mass chaos as kids are trading stuff. It finally settles down. She has us call out the numbers again. She adds up the total one last time, and you know what happened, right? The number went way, way up. Now what's happening? Think about it for a minute. There was an initial input of stuff, in this case the toys. And then all we had is a system of rules in which the rules determined what we could and could not do. And it mimicked free trade. Notice this was not anarchy, right? People didn't get to do whatever they wanted to do. There was a rule of law in place. The teacher enforced it. We're in a school, right? So we knew we couldn't steal from each other. We couldn't kill each other. We couldn't threaten each other, right? So if we were going to trade, that would channel our activities. And that rule of law channeled our activities into engagements that by definition were win-win. Because a trade never takes place unless both people making the trade, if it's a free trade, see themselves as better off as a result. So in other words, just the very logic of the system of the free market is such that if it's really free, people that engage in it are going to benefit. And the more people that engage in it, the more everyone benefits as a result. Now, I find that a sort of profound discovery. As I say, I played this in the 6th grade. I confess I didn't figure out the point until about 30 years later, but I realized this is the genius of the free market. And so simply by thinking about the logic of the game, of the rules, we realize that it's win-win. Now in that case, all we're talking about is the system of trade and the rules. Nothing new's been added to the system. The great news is, though, that very often stuff is added to the system, right? We create wealth. Now here's this kind of other intellectual problem, because a lot of people will think of the economy as a pie, right? Like a cherry pie. And if you're thinking of it that way, again, you're thinking of it as a zero-sum game. And so you think, you know, if the pie, some person gets a quarter of the pie, it's going to leave fewer pieces of the pie for everyone else. And in fact, we've got a slide here. A lot of people think of the economy this way. It's this sort of finite fixed sum. It might sound silly, but in the 20th century, half the human race languished under a system that believed this is what the economy is like. If you read the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx argued that capitalism would destroy itself. And the reason he said that, he said, under a capitalist system, you might start out with a group of people that, you know, in the population, say the proletariat, the workers have most of the wealth in the red here, right? But over time, what happens is that the wealth gets transferred more and more into the hands of fewer of these capitalist individuals, or the bourgeois that were described, until near the end you get to a point in which the vast majority of the wealth is in the hands of a few capitalists, and the vast majority of the population has little or nothing to show for it. And so when you get, let's go just one more here, when you get to this stage, what Marx says is that you get a violent revolution, because obviously that purple, that's the vast majority of the wealth in the hands of a few guys. And the little tiny slice, that's the wealth in the hands of the majority of the population. And so Marx predicts in the Communist Manifesto that you're going to get a revolution. The state will confiscate the means of production and own it on behalf of the people temporarily, and that's called socialism. Socialism is gray, of course, right? Here we're in the socialist stage in which the state owns everything. Now that's what the Marxists thought. It's certainly what Marx thought. No society, unfortunately, ever got past this stage. What's interesting is that the very moment Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848, just a few miles away in factories in Britain, the salaries of the workers were going up rather than down. Now, under the Marxist assumptions, that is impossible. Impossible. And so it was already refuted before he'd even written the book. But how is that possible? Well, it's possible, of course, because in certain kind of economies, we don't just trade beneficially, but we create things that weren't there before. We create wealth that wasn't there before. We all know this, right? But if you want to think of it as a pie, the market reality is quite different. It's like a pie that grows. Right now, I don't actually know of any pie like that, so I actually think that the view of this is inaccurate. But if you want to think of the wealth as a pie, think of it this way. This is the market reality. All right, the pie grows. I know you're all stunned by the prowess of this PowerPoint animation. I'm sorry, it's the best I can do. I've never taken a PowerPoint course, but a lot of people are visual learners, I know that, and so it helps just to sort of think about this. The pie is growing, right? Now, this is a very mysterious thing. How is this possible? Right? How is this possible? I mean, pies don't grow. How do economies grow? Isn't wealth just stuff like real estate and gold and money and things like that? Well, the first thing to notice is that this is possible. What this means is somebody could get fabulously wealthy, not by taking money from someone else or wealth from someone else, but by creating wealth for themselves and others. The late Steve Jobs did not get rich by stealing iPads from homeless guys, right? That's not how it works. We know that. I mean, we know it so obviously that we tend to miss it. All economists know that generally free economies are going to create wealth over time. Now, what I find fascinating about this is that's true economically. But the question is, how is this possible? And I think this is a point in which the Judeo-Christian theological tradition and the insights and discoveries of economics converge. Right? In the biblical understanding of the human person, we are made from the dust of the earth, and yet we have in us the very breath of God. We are created in the image of the free creator. We don't create like God does, right? We don't call things into existence out of nothing. We take what God has created, and as his image bearers, we transform it into things that were not there before. So God creates sand, and he grants to us the dignity to transform it into fiber optic cables and integrated circuits, the nervous system and the brains of the telecommunications and information revolution. We can transmit 1,000 times more information in fiber optic cables made from 60 pounds of sand than we could transmit from a standard copper wire made from 1,000 pounds of copper. That is the image of God at work. What this means is that there's certain types of economic systems that both allow us to trade beneficially and also channel our God-given creativity to create wealth. I wouldn't go so far as to say the Christian worldview sort of entails the free market or something like that, but I would say if you know what man is, if you know we are creatures made in the image of God, you will want and defend an economic system that channels that creativity into greater things for ourselves and for others. That is a very inspiring vision. I hope you find it inspiring, because what this means is that there's not this conflict between our moral and religious beliefs and the economic system that we see that's under attack. People that are interested in fiscal issues and people that are interested in social issues can work together around the same set of principles. Now, that's one of two, those two groups need to work together, but the truth of the matter is a lot of people of faith don't know how to work together. So with that, I want to introduce my co-author, James Robison, who has an, I know, impassioned and inspiring message to give you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Glenn Beck texted me last night after he left, and he said, James, I didn't connect with the people in Colorado last night. Did Glenn Beck connect with the people in Colorado last night? I think it's important to know that with the very bright lights, especially last night, it was impossible to see the audience. But I was able to watch all the people around me. And I told Glenn by return he hit a grand slam. He hit it out of the park. He was a statesman, and I appreciate it. Now, I want you to know that you're witnessing something that is more significant than may come to your mind on first glance. I am a Southern Baptist, very conservative evangelist. Jerry Falwell said, "You make all the rest of us conservatives look like a bunch of liberals." Last night, an evangelical introduced a Mormon. And I called him a friend because he's family. You just heard a Catholic philosopher, now followed by an evangelical Protestant. You may not know it, but what you are witnessing is what is absolutely essential for the survival of freedom as we have known it. We have to stop the damaging bickering, the continual division and dissension that everything within the capacity and character of Creator God literally rebukes. God is calling for a unity, a harmony with the Creator. And as Jay pointed out, we are born in the image of God, co-creators. We didn't move out of the Stone Age because we ran out of rocks. The very thought that you could take sand and create the greatest wealth in America with fiber optics and microchips. We don't really have an energy crisis. We've got a crisis in relationship with Father God, and we do not have a relationship with the family of the Father. And we've got to get that healed. There is a prevailing destructive spirit of divorce that is tearing marriages apart, families apart, and a nation apart. And we've got to put a stop to it. Being created equal does not mean we're created the same. No two snowflakes the same, no two fingerprints the same, no two people the same. The New Testament refers to the family of faith as the body of Christ. The world teaches that what you need to succeed are connections. God says what you need to succeed is connectedness. Every part in the body connected to every other part. I've recently been pointing out to my friends, connect this part of the body properly to this part of the body, submit it to the head, and the hand works properly. The hand of God, the love of God, the compassionate watch care of God must be demonstrated by people who have submitted their lives to the Father and Creator, submitting to His lordship and His headship, connect to one another properly, each one with distinct roles to fulfill, but when connected together, we can put the arms of a loving Father around a broken, devastated world. And let me say to every conservative Republican, you better pull your head out of the sand, and you better understand, if you don't want your epitaph to be, "Thou fool," then you'd better understand that you take some of your creative energy and some of the great capacity that God has given you to create prosperity and wealth, and you focus on the need of the downtrodden and the overlooked. You had best learn to speak the language of the poor, or they're going to destroy prosperity and wealth as we have enjoyed it. And we have been the most prosperous, benevolent nation in history. We are either going to witness in our lifetime the rebirth of freedom and the restoration of the foundation upon which this nation was established to become the most benevolent nation in history, or we're going to witness the death of it. As Ronald Reagan said, if we don't remember we are a nation under God, we will be a nation gone under. God is calling us to a heart harmony with one another that enables us to overcome all the power of evil. Right now, we are witnessing what appears to be a prevailing worldview that is so upside down, so inverted, with God on the bottom, if acknowledged at all. The philosophies and ideals of men, of Marx, of socialism, of progressive liberalism, prevailing, and those people are so deceived as a pilot inverted, not knowing so, when they think they pull up, they continue to take us down. It's as though the Chicago Mafia has ended up in Washington, D.C. I want to make it absolutely clear. Don't blame Democrats or Republicans. The major responsibility rests on the shoulders of people who profess faith in a living, mighty God. While you stayed home and took care of business, somebody's giving you the business. And I can promise you that the enemy of faith and freedom, the enemy of everything that made our nation great, are walking in lockstep. The strangest, oddest bedfellows you've ever seen. But they march in step, just like the consuming locust in Joel chapter 2. They never broke rank. They walked together. They found the places of vulnerability through the windows as thieves, consuming the wealth, the productivity of an agrarian society. The consuming locusts in America are the liberal, progressive socialists that are destroying the potential in our nation. There's only one way to stop it. Rend your heart, not your garments. Stop going through the motions of religion and get in a relationship with God. And if you say you love God and you don't love your brother, you're a liar. The very fact that I'm standing here, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, with a Catholic philosopher, I don't even have a college degree. Lynn Beck and I are kind of cut out of the same mold. I told you last night when I introduced Glenn, I'm the product of a forced sex relationship imposed on a practical nurse, a home nurse. She conceived me. In desperation, with no husband, meager income, she said, I've got to get rid of the child. The doctor said no. Possibilities. I lived in poverty without a father. I'm so typical in so many ways of the inverted, prevailing worldview that's destroying our world. Fatherlessness. Fatherless because people don't know God the Father. They don't understand commitment. And this room is filled with successful people. And success and wealth is not our problem. The farmer that Jesus said, thou fool, this night your soul is required of thee. He didn't say that because he had an abundant harvest and a fertile field. He didn't say it because the harvest necessitated bigger barns. He said it because he was so consumed with himself that he could not see realistically the challenges, which are in fact opportunities for thinkers to deal with. The wealth creators ought to own the poverty problem. Don't turn it over to the federal government. They can't manage $1 well. Don't put salve on your conscience because you give them 30% of your income to mismanage. Stop doing it. Do what Tom Cousins did in Atlanta. Rebuild the inner city. Turn the whole place inside out. There's enough brain power in this room alone to correct our nation's perilous course. There are enough professing Christians here. Pull your head out of the sand. Stand up on the rock of God's truth. Refuse to give the devil another inch. Don't give the world philosophies prevailing your future, your children's. We are robbing and stealing from children yet to be born. God forgive us all. I will not sit back and watch this nation die. I will use every ounce of energy and strength and ability God has given me to awaken the church, to awaken the people of faith, to quit arguing and be an answer to Jesus' prayer, that we be one with the Father and perfected in supernatural unity with one another. That's what you see with me and Jay. That's what you see with me and Glenn Beck when I went to him. And Glenn said, when you came to me a Mormon and you an evangelical Protestant, you were coming to a leper, but you loved me. You loved me. It's changing my life. Love never, never fails. Hope does not ride into town on Air Force One. It doesn't ride on the backs of donkeys or elephants. I know the Bible says someday the lion will lie down with a lamb. I wish I could just have enough influence to get a donkey to lie down with an elephant. Have a civil discussion so we could have better civil government. My mother took me as a boy into poverty. I didn't have an address. We got our mail at someone else's house. When I filled out the little survey card at school to tell about my dad, I didn't have one. I lived on the alleys behind someone's house on a dump, a dirty river. I bathed in the Colorado. I was 5 to 10% white where I lived. A wonderful thing happened. No one taught me to hate opportunity and success. No one told me that success was an enemy. And I looked out from the mire and the muck and the misery of my impoverished situation and my dysfunctional family, and I saw possibilities. I saw opportunity. I went to work at age 12 every day for 40 cents an hour. No one told me that was too little. No one told me I was too young. 3 months after I went to work, the manager of the store said, "You're the greatest worker I've ever seen." He put me over produce. He put me over dairy. He put me over the stock department. He had University of Texas students working, and he said, "Son, I've never seen anything like you." He said, "I'd let you run the meat department, but they have a law. You've got to be 18. He said, "I'll tell you what, boy, I bet when you grow up you could manage a store just like this." My little 12-year-old mind that hadn't been flipped into an inverted worldview, my little 12-year-old mind said, "When I grow up, I can own this store." That's what must happen. And do you know how we get the truth of possibilities out and potential? We become exactly what Jesus commissioned us to be. We become salt and light. Light illuminates the way, everything that's out of place, how to put it in place, and the proper way to go. And Jesus said, don't you hide that light under any covering of conformity or compromise. Do not cover it with religion when a vital relationship is critical. And let me tell you how many of my friends, many people right here, have allowed that light to be hidden. You have taken care of business in the light of your own situation, and you have never gotten that light up on a lampstand to stand by other lights and become the city set on a hill that cannot, will not, and must not be hidden. And unless we do that, what Jesus said about salt, we will witness. Jesus said if salt loses its effect, what does salt do? It protects the precious, the priceless, and adds flavor to all aspects of life. Jesus said if the salt loses its effect, it's good for nothing but to be trampled under the feet of men. What are you watching happen right now? Because while we've hidden the light at church, at home, and we've enjoyed the blessings and benefits, we have not become the light that cannot be hidden, the city that cannot be hidden. And we are watching the sacred and the precious trampled under the feet of God-denying individuals. And the only hope is for us to come together, first fall on our face before God, and then stand on our feet for God. He is the Father, we are family, and He is our hope for restoring freedom. God bless you.